Section 1. Avoid big risks. This section has only one chapter, but it is the most important one in this book. If for some reason you lose the book after reading chapter 1, I believe you still will have more than gotten your money's worth. The problem with our investment community is that we don't take investing seriously. Seriously. Those of you who are in the investing profession are probably bristling with indignation right now. You travel 200 days a year, work 60 to 80 hours a week, deal with irate and demanding clients, attend excruciatingly boring conferences, your spouse and kids rarely see you, and the stress of beating the markets is making you look 10 years older than your actual age. And I have the temerity to tell you that you are not taking your job seriously? Well, if you are so angry, answer this question for me. Would you bet your life on your next investment? In this chapter, I discuss how betting your life is a remarkably sound strategy for investing and how adopting this approach has led to the spectacular success of all living organisms over millions of years. All the investment advice from well-known books, investment gurus, and finance academic centers on making investments. This chapter is about not making investments. I will argue that learning the skill of not investing is harder and more important than learning how to invest. Chapter 1. Oh, to be a bumblebee. On the other hand, in some cases, as with the elephant and rhinoceros, none are destroyed by beasts of prey. Even the tiger in India most rarely attacks a young elephant protected by its dam. Charles Darwin, On the Origin of Species, Chapter 3, Struggle for Existence. We have written in past reports about the disappointments that usually result from purchases and operation of turnaround businesses. Literally hundreds of turnaround possibilities in dozens of industries have been described to us over the years, and, either as participants or observers, we have tracked performance against expectations. Our conclusion is that, with few exceptions, when a management with a reputation for brilliance tackles a business with a reputation for poor fundamental economics, it is the reputation of the business that remains intact. Warren Buffett, Annual Letter to Shareholders, 1980. When you start reading a book on investing, I assume you want to be dazzled by the author's brilliance. It won't happen this time. I will begin this journey by profiling my stupidity. After spending 6 years at McKinsey, I joined Warburg Pincus, a global private equity firm. After a few years of investing, I had learned the basics. Or at least I thought I had. They appeared simple: invest in a high-quality entrepreneur running a growth business and don't overpay. I had lucked out on a couple of investments by then, and so was flying high. An entrepreneur running a successful business approached us to raise funds for expansion in the early 2000s. The business had a reasonable scale by Indian standards, and the company had many marquee clients, including one of India's largest businesses. Notably, this company had also made inroads in overseas markets. It wasn't common to see Indian companies outside the software services industry build a thriving export business in those days. I started our diligence process and did the usual. Spent time with the founder and senior managers to understand their strategy and competitive differentiation, visited the company offices, talked to several customers in India and Europe, employed a firm specializing in forensic diligence to assess governance issues, hired the leading legal and accounting firms in India to perform diligence, and quizzed some industry experts on the company's potential for growth and value creation. Everything was looking good, and I didn't even have to haggle much on valuation or the legal documents. I communicated my enthusiasm to my bosses and got the green light. The company raised $50 million, a big sum of money for a private equity investment in India at the time, and I enthusiastically led the investment. Warburg Pincus's return on this investment? 0. The firm lost all its money. It was entirely my fault. I had screwed up. Big time. Before making money, learn not to lose money. The next time you are in a bookshop, go to the section with investing books. Many of you below the age of 30 probably don't know what a bookshop is. No worries, go to Amazon and type in investment books. Do you notice anything common across titles that scream things like Investing 101 or One Up on Wall Street, or You Can Be a Stock Market Genius, or New Era Value Investing? All of them are about how to make money. Duh. What else is an investing book supposed to teach? I hope to convince you that an essential prerequisite for making money is the ability not to lose money. Almost everyone, and I say almost because the statement does not apply to my wife, makes mistakes. These errors fall into two broad categories: we do things we are not supposed to, and we don't do things we are supposed to. For me, buying a hot fudge sundae at McDonald's falls into the first category, and not keeping in regular touch with my school and college friends falls into the second. All investors, too, make these two mistakes. Let me borrow from the field of statistics to describe them. The first kind, dubbed a type 1 error by statisticians who can never be blamed for being creative, occurs when I make a bad investment because I erroneously think it is a good one. It is the error of committing self-harm and is also called a false positive or error of commission. A type 2 error occurs when I reject a good investment because I erroneously think it is bad. This is the error of rejecting a potential benefit and can be termed a false negative or error of omission. Every investor, including Warren Buffett, makes these two errors on a regular basis. They either harm themselves or walk away from a great opportunity. As any statistician will tell you, the risk of these two errors is inversely related. Minimizing the risk of a type 1 error typically increases the risk of a type 2 error, and minimizing the risk of a type 2 error increases the risk of a type 1 error. Intuitively, this seems logical. Imagine an overly optimistic investor who sees an upside in almost every investment. This individual will make several type 1 errors by committing to bad investments but also will not miss out on the few good investments. On the other hand, an overly cautious investor who keeps finding reasons to reject every investment is likely to make very few bad investments but will lose out on some good investments. Investors can't have their cake and eat it too. They need to choose to be more sensitive to making one type of error while living with the consequences of making more errors of the other kind. What should one do? What should you do? In other words, which of the following investment strategies should you use? 1. Making a lot of investments so as not to lose out on some good opportunities and, as a result, living with some failed investments. Or 2. Being highly selective to avoid making bad investments, thereby missing out on some good investments? Let's turn to evolution to seek the answer. The goal of all animals is to survive for as long as possible, at least until they reproduce. In the animal world, everyone is both prey and predator. Yes, even we, the Homo sapiens. How are we prey? Remember COVID-19? Let's start with the prey. What would be a type 1 error for a prey animal? It would equate to inflicting sufficient harm on itself to compromise its fitness. Let me illustrate the case of an adult male deer to explore two kinds of type 1 errors. The first kind occurs when the deer is thirsty and is near a watering hole. Born by instinct or experience or both, the deer knows that the watering hole could sound its death knell if a lion or leopard or crocodile is hiding, waiting for the opportunity of an easy meal. If the deer chooses to approach the watering hole, it slakes its thirst quickly and then moves away. And if it mistakenly draws near while a predator is ready and waiting, its life ends. From the fossil record, we know that the deer that we see today evolved from ungulates about 15 to 30 million years ago. They have survived millions of years amid ferocious predators by being very sensitive to making type 1 errors, errors of not being too careful. If they weren't so, the species would have become extinct. Obviously, some individual deer do end up making the fatal error of commission by drinking at watering holes when predators are present, but the species as a whole has done remarkably well. If you have seen African wildlife videos or gone on a safari, you will have noticed how vigilant wildebeests, antelopes, zebras, and other herbivores are. They seem to see danger where there is none. But it is this alertness that has allowed them to survive and thrive for millions of years. A type 1 error of underestimating a threat could be the last error one of these animals makes. The second kind of type 1 error that the deer can commit is seen in mating rituals. One fascinating sight in the wild for me, and dare I say for the female deer, is two adult male deer fighting over the exclusive control of a harem. Let me describe the mating behavior of the red deer found in many parts of Europe and in Western and Central Asia. The males are called stags and the females hinds. The hinds live in groups called harems. Stags armed with impressively large antlers fight with one another to gain exclusive mating rights to the harem females. I have put the word fight in quotation marks because the stags rarely end up fighting physically. A type 1 error, or the error of commission, in this scenario would be the mistake of committing to fighting, thereby risking becoming injured or disabled. Although the prize of a harem is quite substantial, the stags show extreme sensitivity to the type 1 error by dueling very rarely. Here's how it works. Stags are capable of mating when they reach the age of about 16 months, but they don't usually mate for the first time until they are at least 6 years old. This is because they don't develop large and powerful antlers before this age. They could fight and take a chance, but none do. They could get seriously hurt, which could compromise their fitness for future mating or even their life. When they do reach mating age, they approach the rutting grounds where hinds have gathered. But they don't start fighting immediately. Scientists have observed that locking antlers is almost always the last resort, and a rutting stag will typically fight only 5 times during the 3 weeks of the rut. A series of highly choreographed rituals that serve to actively discourage physical contact precedes the locking of horns. When two stags challenge each other, one emits an impressive roar. The other then responds with seemingly equal vigor because sound quality is a reliable indicator of the strength of one's rival. The roaring may go on for more than an hour, with the number of roars peaking at 3 to 4 per minute. At this stage, based on the quality of roars, one of the stags typically withdraws. If they are unable to decide their relative strengths based on roars, they move on to the next stage of the fight by walking with stiff legs parallel to each other. Yes, they threaten their opponent by walking. This parallel walking spectacle lasts many minutes, during which time the rivals assess each other's strength and physical condition from a distance of about 2 meters. During this period, they also thrash the vegetation and roar to appear more intimidating to their rival. Again, one may choose to withdraw at this stage. Only if both stags refuse to back down do they choose to clash antlers. To me, it seems more like a push-anchive match. This show, most of these interactions don't look like a real brawl, can last several minutes, at the end of which one stag admits defeat and runs away. If this were a human boxing match, the crowd would trash the arena because the boxers would be screaming and hitting the ground instead of each other. Stags have found great evolutionary success because at each stage of the contest, they minimize the error of committing self-harm. They do not even attempt to duel until they have big enough antlers, and even after acquiring their deadly weapons, they refuse to engage until they believe they have more than a fair chance of winning. Even their duel is not deadly. Scientists have observed that only about 5% of rutting stags receive permanent injuries. The bottom line is that the stag's evolutionary success, at least in part, can be attributed to their instinct to preserve life and limb, to minimize the risk of committing a type 1 error. But there is a significant trade-off to the approach of minimizing the risk of type 1 errors. The deer make many more type 2 errors. A type 2 error, or the error of omission, means avoiding a watering hole where no predator is waiting. Stags also too often withdraw from a rutting duel when they have a good chance of winning the harem. The cost is the lost opportunity to drink water or to mate. In some cases, a type 2 error may turn out to be a fatal mistake. A thirsty deer may not be able to run quickly enough to escape a predator, and an overcautious stag may not get to pass his genes on to the next generation. But on average, making this trade-off in favor of reducing the number of errors of self-harm while tolerating a higher number of errors of rejecting potential benefit has worked quite well for the species. Committing a type 1 error can be and has been deadlier than the loss of a single animal. It can lead to the extinction of an entire species. The flightless dodo bird, a native of Mauritius, was first spotted by sailors in 1507 and went extinct by 1681. Dodos were bigger than turkeys, and since they had no natural predators on the isolated island, they were not afraid of the human invaders. They committed the cardinal type 1 error. They did not avoid the humans when they should have, which led to their extinction. Let's now turn our attention to the predator. The predator, too, can make two types of error. It can commit itself to killing prey that turns out to be too dangerous or too large or too fast, type 1 error, or it can refrain from attacking prey that it could easily have killed, type 2 error. Which error do you think a predator makes more often? A cheetah is the fastest mammal on Earth and routinely achieves speeds of 80 to 100 kilometers per hour while chasing prey. It sacrifices size and bulk for speed. A cheetah typically weighs 34 to 54 kilograms, 75 to 120 pounds, which is significantly less than a lion, whose weight typically ranges from 170 to 230 kilograms, 375 to 500 pounds. Hence, a cheetah usually preys on smaller animals like birds, rabbits, and small antelopes. A cheetah will never attempt to kill an adult water buffalo, a favorite prey of lions. The cheetah is simply trying to avoid getting hurt. Committing a type 1 error will lead either to death. Water buffaloes can turn on their hunters aggressively, or wasted energy when a cheetah chases an antelope that was too far away to begin with. These mistakes, in turn, will lead to hunger and poor hunting performance. For a cheetah mother, a type 1 error can also lead to the death of her offspring. The fact the species has been successful for eons demonstrates that cheetahs, as a species, have not committed too many type 1 errors. A type 2 error for a cheetah would mean not chasing prey it should have. This would leave the cheetah and maybe even her babies hungry, but they would all live to see another day. Deer and cheetahs do not manufacture complex decision tree diagrams with associated probabilities to make decisions in their lives. These animals do what they do because natural selection has honed their instincts over countless generations. Natural selection among animals is incessant and merciless and has produced millions of species, all of whom adhere to this simple principle: minimize the risk of committing type 1 errors to curtail the risk of injury or death, and learn to live with type 2 errors or foregone benefits. What about plants, the ultimate source of all life on Earth? Plants have been immensely successful evolutionarily. The first land plants appeared in the Ordovician era about 490 million years ago, and there are about 400,000 plant species found on our green planet. Unlike animals, the dramas of whose lives play out on African safaris, on wildlife TV channels, and in children's books, plants may seem uninteresting, sedate, peaceful, and inactive. Nothing could be further from the truth. Look closely and you will notice that the life of a plant in many ways is more exciting and action-packed than that of almost any animal. Paradoxically, this is because plants can't move. If they are malnourished, they can't move to a different location to feed. When attacked by herbivores, they don't have feet to run or claws to fight back. When infected by pathogens, they can't be offered treatment and cuddles like we humans can. Plants can choose to commit resources broadly to two areas: defending against attacks or growing. As with deer and cheetahs, any error that significantly compromises life or fitness for a plant can be categorized as a type 1 error. Since the lack of a proper defense may prove fatal to a plant, a type 1 error, or an error of commission, occurs when the plant does not devote resources to protecting itself. A type 2 error occurs when a plant directs energy toward preservation when it should have invested in growth. This error of omission may not kill the plant but may compromise its ability to grow and reproduce relative to its competitors. Ample evidence from nature suggests that plants avoid type 1 errors at the cost of committing more type 2 errors. Let's examine how plants handle insect herbivores. The first defense of plants against insects is physical structures like wax, thorns, and trichomes. A trichome is the layer of hairs on leaves, stems, and fruits and can be spiral, straight, hooked, or glandular. A dense trichome on a leaf impedes the movement of insects and their larvae, thereby reducing their ability to damage the leaf epidermis. Trichomes in glandular form can secrete poisonous or otherwise harmful chemicals like flavonoids and alkaloids which repel insects. Some glandular trichomes can also trap insects. Producing and maintaining trichomes is metabolically expensive for a plant and prevents it from making additional leaves, stems, or fruits. Thus, when there are few or no insects, we should expect trichomes to be tiny or non-existent. But when there is an insect attack, to reduce the risk of a type 1 error, erroneously investing in growth instead of preparing defenses, we should expect the plant to start making trichomes. And this is what we see. For example, scientists have observed that when adult leaf beetles attack the willow plant, new leaves grown after the attack develop higher trichome density. The willow plant redirects its resources from growth to defense as a result of sensing a predator. Trichome density also increases in other species like pepperwort and wild radish after an insect attack. When a butterfly species attacks a black mustard plant, the trichome density of the plant's leaves increases, as does the production of pungent chemicals called glucosinolates. Within a few days or weeks following an insect attack, trichome density can increase from 25 to 1,000%. A plant's defense mechanisms are not limited to trichomes, however. Lignin is a phenol compound that plays a vital role in a plant's defense against insects. Lignin does two things to the leaves: it increases their toughness, thereby making them unpalatable, and it reduces their nutritional content. A leaf with excess lignin would be anathema for insects. Just as with trichomes, it is costly to produce lignin. Also, as with trichomes, the plant ramps up its lignin production after an insect attack. In addition to lignin, compounds called flavonoids, tannins, lectins, and peroxidases also serve to reduce the risk of plants committing type 1 errors by directing resources to defense rather than growth. What I have described are direct defenses against pests. But many plants also resort to indirect defenses, which are rarely seen in animals. An indirect defense works on the simple principle that my enemy's enemy is my friend. It works simply and beautifully like this. When a plant senses an insect attack, it releases some chemical compounds from its leaves, flowers, and fruits into the atmosphere. These chemical compounds attract predators of the insects attacking the plants. For example, plants like lima beans and Arabidopsis release a chemical called methyl salicylate to attract insect predators like big-eyed bugs, ladybird beetles, commonly known as ladybugs, and green lacewings. This trick is not limited to the aerial parts of plants. Roots, too, can release chemicals that attract underground predators to underground pests. For example, when western corn rootworm threatens maize plants, the maize roots release a chemical that attracts a nematode species that preys upon the rootworm. When aphids attack, many plants emit a chemical called beta-farnesene. It does not appear to be a coincidence that when predators attack aphids, the aphids release this chemical, presumably warning other aphids to stay away. Thus, a plant releasing beta-farnesene is equivalent to a deer mimicking a lion roar when attacked by a leopard. Plants, like animals, have found a way to their spectacular evolutionary success by focusing on reducing their errors of commission. In other words, like their animal counterparts, they avoid taking risks to their life and well-being at the cost of giving up some potentially juicy opportunities. Buffett's 2 rules of investing. As one should expect, Warren Buffett figured out this lesson from evolutionary theory before almost everyone else. He famously coined his 2 rules of investing as follows. Rule number 1, never lose money. Rule number 2, never forget rule number 1. But wait a minute. What does he mean by commanding us to never lose money? How can one choose not to lose money? Isn't that what every investor wants? Why would any investor deliberately wish to lose money? In fact, Buffett seems to have violated his own 2 rules on many occasions. For example, in 1993, Berkshire bought Dexter Shoe for $433 million in Berkshire stock. As he detailed in his 2007 annual letter, what I had assessed as a durable competitive advantage vanished within a few years. That move made the cost to Berkshire shareholders not $400 million, but rather $3.5 billion. In essence, I gave away 1.6% of a wonderful business, one now valued at $220 billion, to buy a worthless business. In his 2014 annual letter, he admitted his mistake in Berkshire's Tesco investment. We sold Tesco shares throughout the year and now are out of this position. Our after-tax loss from this investment was $444 million. More recently, in the middle of the COVID-19 pandemic market meltdown, Buffett sold all his airline stocks. He had invested between $7 billion and $8 billion for large stakes in 4 airlines: American, Delta, Southwest, and United. Berkshire's position was worth a bit more than $4 billion at the time of his sale. It turned out I was wrong, he said. Back to Buffett's 2 rules. Despite losing money occasionally, what is he asking us to do when he orders us not to lose any? Buffett has never explicitly explained this, at least I have never found an explanation, but this is what I think he means: avoid big risks. Don't make type 1 errors. Don't commit to an investment in which the probability of losing money is higher than the probability of making money. Think about risk first, not return. Before we go any further, allow me a slight digression to get the definition of risk out of the way. The definition I use in this book is not the same as the one defined by corporate finance theorists. Finance theory claims that risk is the chance that the actual investment return will differ from the expected investment return. Thus, if an asset is highly volatile, it will be classified as riskier than an asset that is not as volatile. If you think about this for a moment, you will conclude that this is nonsensical. For any investor, risk should simply be the probability of incurring a capital loss. The following example will make this clear. Let's say I am evaluating an investment in a high-quality grocery retailer. The retailer has been performing quite well, resulting in a steadily increasing stock price over the years. Let's say the market price was $90 in early 2020. After the COVID-19 crisis, the stock market became highly volatile and the market price of this business dropped to $30. Let's also assume that you have done your work and have concluded that grocery retailers may benefit from the crisis since consumers will stock up their pantries. Which would be a riskier investment, investing in the business at $90 or at $30? If your intuition says $90, you are right. This is because the risk of losing money is greater at $90 than at $30. But believe it or not, academics of finance would argue exactly the opposite. No, I am not kidding. They would conclude that the post-COVID-19 crisis business is riskier because the volatility of the stock price has increased. We at Nalanda never bring stock price volatility into a risk discussion. We define risk as the probability of capital loss. The higher the probability of loss, the higher the risk. If my investment in Company A is likely to lose more money over my investment in Company B, I will deem Company A to be riskier than Company B irrespective of past or future volatility in their stock prices. As Buffett's diktat shows, he is focused on minimizing risk and, in doing so, has become the envy of the entire investment world, which seems obsessed with running after every half-baked business idea. Buffett and the natural world are fixated on minimizing the risk of type 1 errors. Should we follow them blindly? Will the explicit lesson from Buffett and the implicit one from leopards and legumes work for ordinary mortals like us? Why or why not? A great investor is a great rejector. Let's walk through a simple example that contrasts two different investment styles. And let's then see if Buffett's advice makes sense. According to data from the World Bank, the United States had 4,400 listed companies in 2018. For simplicity, let's assume around 4,000. First, we need to decide how many of these are good investments. Let's keep it simple and classify a good investment as one that will make us a decent return over the long run. It has a competent and honest management team, a modest growth rate, makes enough money, and has low leverage. If you are a finance nerd, you are probably bristling at this moment. What in the world do I mean by vague terms like decent, enough, and competent? Don't worry, we will get into numbers shortly, but at this stage, let's just say we know a good investment when we see it. Let's assume that 25% of the listed universe comprises good investments. If you talk to practitioners, that is, actual investors, you will not get a number too far from this percentage. In any event, the exact percentage is less significant, as we will see. Thus, we can say there are 1,000 good investments and 3,000 bad investments in the US listed universe by this logic. Again, don't get too pained about this strict dichotomy, it is serving a purpose that we will get to. Let's say you encounter a savvy investor who claims that he is right 80% of the time in his investment decisions. It is usually a he. We men are evolutionarily programmed for empty exaggerations. Stated differently, if he encounters a bad investment, that is, one in which he will not make any money, he rejects it 80% of the time. If he sees a good investment, that is, one in which he will make money, he makes a favorable investment decision 80% of the time. Thus, his rates of type 1 and type 2 errors are both 20%. If this star investor makes an investment decision, what is the probability that it is a good investment? You'd say 80%, right? Wrong. The answer is 57%. But why? Isn't he right 80% of the time? How can we go from 80% to 57%? Here's how. There are 1,000 good investments in the market, and since this investor makes a type 2 error 20% of the time, that is, he mistakenly rejects 20% of these, he will select only 800 companies from his list. The market also has 3,000 bad investments, and since he makes type 1 errors 20% of the time, that is, he mistakenly accepts 20% of these, he will mistakenly select 600 companies from this list, thinking that they are good investments. Thus, his universe of what he thinks are good investments will be 1,400 companies, 800 plus 600. Are you with me? Good. Now to the most interesting part. Of these 1,400 businesses that the investor thinks are good investments, how many do you think are good investments? Only 800. Hence, the probability of his making a good investment will be 800 divided by 1,400 is equal to 57%. So here is the unfortunate conclusion. Even if an investor is endowed with the divine power of being right 80% of the time, the probability that he will select a good investment is only 57%. Even though he is right 80% of the time, 43% of his investments will turn out to be bad. The reason is simple, especially when we incorporate our prior knowledge of the business world, there are very few good investments in the market. Let me repeat this statement, which is the bedrock of our philosophy and that of the rest of this book. There are very few good investments in the market. As we have just seen, the prevalence of type 1 and type 2 errors can lull us investors into thinking that we are better than we really are. But these errors carry a deeper meaning for our profession. Given a choice, which error would you like to reduce and why? Let's say that our investor A, decides to become better at rejecting bad investments and reduces his rate of type 1 errors from 20% to 10%. Thus, from the 3,000 bad investments in the market, he will select only 300 businesses, 10% times 3,000. As his type 2 error rate remains 20%, he will erroneously reject 200 of the 1,000 good investments, thereby selecting 800 investments. Thus, investor A has selected 1,100 investments, 300 plus 800, but only 800 of these are good. In this scenario, investor A's probability of selecting a good investment improves from 57% to 73%, 800 divided by 1,100. I assume you will admit that this is quite a dramatic improvement in his success rate. Investor B, unlike investor A, is more focused on not missing out on good opportunities. He chooses to reduce his rate of type 2 errors from 20% to 10% and keeps his rate of type 1 errors at 20%. Thus, of the 1,000 good investments, he will select 900, 90% times 1,000, and of the 3,000 bad investments, he will mistakenly assume that 600 are good, 20% times 3,000. Thus, Investor B has selected 1,500 investments, 600 plus 900, but only 900 are good. Thus, Investor B's probability of selecting a good business improves from 57% to 60%, 900 divided by 1,500. This is an improvement, but only by 3 percentage points. Good, but not great. The relative impact of reducing each type of error is quite stark, as shown in Table 1.1. Thus, there is a 16 percentage point improvement in investor performance by reducing the rate of Type 1 errors from 20% to 10%. On the other hand, reducing the rate of Type 2 errors by the same amount improves performance by only 3 percentage points. Guess what happens if another investor, Investor C, improves his rate of both Type 1 and Type 2 errors from 20% to 10%? I was flabbergasted when I first saw the answer, 75%. This is barely above the 73% achieved by Investor A, who is focused only on reducing Type 1 errors. A dramatic improvement in performance comes only when the rate of Type 1 errors of making bad investments, is reduced. Thus, whereas most investment books and college curricula focus on teaching how to make good investments, everyone would be better off by learning how not to make bad investments. An investment career is probably among the very few that rewards the skeptic more than the optimist. Buffett is the best investor in the world because he is the best rejecter in the world. How to avoid big risks? It's all well and good to assert that we should learn from the evolutionary success of animals and plants to avoid big risks and become better investors. But how? There are myriad ways of learning life lessons: parents, siblings, one's spouse, friends, books, movies, school, college, work, and leaders are a few sources that come to mind. I will never really know why I am what I am. But I am reasonably confident of the identity of my primary teacher and guide in the area of investing, my own mistakes. Early in my investing career at Warburg Pincus, I committed the cardinal sin of minimizing errors of omission instead of trying to control Type 1 errors. I was too afraid to miss out on good opportunities. I founded Nalanda after gaining more than 8 years of investing experience. Our reasonable success of staying away from trouble is the result of the follies of the first 3 to 4 years of my career. In my case, nothing has succeeded like a failure. Most investors will keep making Type 1 errors, making bad investments, throughout their careers. At least I have, and I will. It's inevitable. So when I say that we need to avoid Type 1 errors, I am proposing that we try to avoid the avoidable Type 1 error by not taking on big risks. What is a big risk? It is not clear to me that a definition is possible or even desirable for a practitioner. Instead of defining big risk, let me describe the kinds of situations we avoid at Nalanda. This is not an exhaustive list, but hopefully it will give you a good sense of the kinds of risks we don't price. Being wary of criminals, crooks, and cheats. People don't change. Especially criminals, crooks, and cheats. As permanent owners, we at Nalanda have no interest in a business owned or run by someone who defrauds customers, suppliers, employees, or shareholders. When we come across such a person, we don't ask if the business is cheap enough for the risk to be mitigated. We don't ask if we could persuade this individual to change. We don't ask if their crimes are trivial enough to ignore. We simply walk away. I don't know about other countries, but the Indian capital market, I am sad to admit, teams with dodgy and deceitful promoters, Indian parlance for the largest or controlling shareholders. As a result, we are highly vigilant and do not even start assessing the business fundamentals until we have convinced ourselves that the promoters have impeccable integrity. A KPMG report on the Indian private equity (PE) industry euphemistically claimed many risks are common to all emerging markets, political and regulatory uncertainty and weak corporate governance among them. Many of these risks are more likely in India even if they are not unique, such as working with family-owned businesses, navigating IPO exits, and compliance risks. This was a polite way of saying, beware of being swindled. We employ a 2-level process for this assessment. We always hire a forensic diligence expert to assess if the owner or senior managers have a dubious past. During this period, we conduct our parallel diligence on the promoters and managers by scouring the media, studying past annual reports, listening to their conference call recordings, reading their interviews, and talking to people who have had personal and business dealings with them. In almost half the cases, we ask the external firm to further probe issues that have arisen during our diligence, for example, money leakage for large capex contracts or a cash payment to senior managers. This dual check provided by outsourcing and insourcing has prevented a lot of heartburn for us over the years. More importantly, it has saved a lot of money for our investors. But shouldn't this be obvious? There is nothing extraordinarily insightful about claiming that one needs to check for promoters' integrity before committing capital. You are right. Governance checks in India should be par for the course. But they are not. Let's take an example of investing in the infrastructure and real estate sectors. In India, these two industries are highly regulated, involve a lot of cash transactions, and require a plethora of approvals. Hence, over the years, they have attracted a set of entrepreneurs who can successfully manage the system. Looking for the proverbial needle in a haystack would be a cakewalk compared to finding infrastructure and real estate entrepreneurs who don't mistreat minority shareholders. We have chosen to avoid these industries completely. When we launched Nalanda in 2007, it was a boom time for fundraising in the real estate and infrastructure sectors. According to a McKinsey report from 2005 to 2008, real estate absorbed almost a quarter of all PE investments, and infrastructure's share was nearly 30%. A relatively large portion of these ended up in a disaster, and PE and public market investors lost billions of dollars. Real estate returns on exit were only 2%, and only 9% of energy segment investments could get an exit. One key reason for this unfortunate outcome was the adverse selection of entrepreneurs by the fund management community. But it would be hypocritical of me to complain about others when I, too, have fallen into the same trap. Let's go back to the business for which I led the investment of $50 million from Warburg Pincus and which seemed to have ticked all the boxes. Here's what I did not tell you on the first page of this chapter. The governance check from the outsourced firm had given a clean chit to the promoter, but our internal team had heard some informal negative buzz about him. It wasn't strong or unequivocal, but it was buzz nevertheless. I ignored it. I am still not sure why. Maybe I trusted our outsourced provider more than I should have, maybe I had become arrogant owing to recent successes, maybe I had been too charmed by the smooth-talking promoter, maybe I was in too deep after completing many months of diligence. Or maybe all of the above. At this stage, I should have gone back to our service provider and asked them to do more work. I also should have dug deeper into the veracity of the criticisms of the promoter. I didn't do either of these things. It was too late by the time we discovered this individual's shenanigans. He had sucked the company dry and Warburg lost almost all its money. Since this incident, I have been extra cautious, both at Warburg and at Nalanda. We never invest unless we are fully and absolutely satisfied with the governance standards. We haven't lost a single dollar at Nalanda yet on dodgy promoters, but this doesn't mean we never will. But if we ever do, it will not be because we didn't do our best. Some investors may object that if the company's survival is not under threat owing to the bad behavior of the promoter, investing in a somewhat shady business at a very cheap valuation may be a good way of making money over the medium to long term. The fact remains that there are some well-known dodgy businesses in India whose stock prices have done reasonably well over the past few years. But we have never played this game and never will. Our philosophy of permanent ownership demands that we partner only with promoters of the highest integrity. And so that is what we do. Avoiding turnarounds. Imagine a tennis match in which Roger Federer is playing John, who is ranked 500 in the world. I ask you to bet 5% of your wealth on John winning the match. You refuse, I hope. But John wants you to bet on him. And so, before the match starts, in a face-to-face meeting with you, John makes an impassioned plea to ignore his ranking and recognize his innate talent. He speaks eloquently and makes a slick PowerPoint presentation on his plan to defeat Federer. John says he has been watching Federer's game very closely for the past 2 years, and his plan, he believes, is exemplary. To bolster his claim, John invites one of the leading tennis coaches in the world who admits that John's plan is laudable and that he has a real chance of beating Federer. It's decision time for you. Would you bet 5% of your wealth on John? This is exactly what happens in the world of investing. Managements that have underperformed for long periods are able to convince investors to bet on their businesses with nothing but fancy promises and McKinsey reports. I blame neither managements nor McKinsey because optimism is not a crime. But I do get baffled at investors who, despite having access to data that amply demonstrate the incompetence of incumbent management, are willing to bet their clients' money on the hope that this management will suddenly morph into an industry beater in the near future. More often than not, the dream scenario hyped up by the management morphs into a nightmare. Occasionally, the board or the owner fires the previous CEO and brings in a new one to turn around a struggling business. The new CEO usually comes with an impressive resume and many are highly qualified. But we don't bet on these turnarounds either. An exceptional CEO was impressive in a certain context with a certain business. This context and this business are different. How are we to know that the new CEO, faced with a set of challenges they have almost certainly never met before, will do what they are promising to do? We don't. I know what you are thinking. The upside if we were able to detect a genuine turnaround would be significant. Agreed. Let's assess the following two situations. Case 1. A company that has been very profitable over many decades has recently fallen prey to smaller and more nimble competitors. It has suffered massive losses over the past 2 years. The company sells its highly engineered products to medium and large businesses. The board starts searching for a new CEO and identifies a promising candidate. There are, however, a few worrying problems with this choice. The candidate does not understand technology. He does not understand how to sell to businesses because he has run a company that sells biscuits to consumers. And he has had no experience turning around any business, let alone a complex engineering one like this. Would you invest in this business once the CEO takes over? Case 2. A venerated 100-year-old department store has been struggling with falling sales. Over the past 4 years, sales have fallen 10% from $20 billion to $18 billion, and the operating income has plummeted about 65% from $1.1 billion to $380 million. The stock price has crashed from $81 to $32. The board appoints one of the world's leading retail experts as the new CEO of this business. He has had 2 great successes in the past few years. As VP of merchandising at one of the largest U.S. retailers, he made the store appeal to young and trendy consumers. He also struck several designer partnerships that were a huge hit with shoppers. His next job was at a large company where he was responsible for opening retail stores. He hit the ball completely out of the park. The sales per square foot at these stores now exceeds even luxury retailers like LVMH. His innovations in design and service at these stores were so popular that shoppers now need to book an appointment many days in advance in many cities across the world. Would you invest in this business once the CEO takes over? I would not buy the shares of the first business but would load up on the second. I assume, dear reader, that you would do the same. We would both be dead wrong. You and I would have missed out on a 7-fold increase in stock price over the next 10 years in the first business. We would have been wiped out completely, yes, with a 100% loss in the second. The first business is IBM, and its famous turnaround in the late 1990s was led by Lou Gerstner, the ex-CEO of R.J.R. Nabisco. Previously called International Business Machines, IBM was a behemoth that ruled the world of technology in the latter half of the 20th century. In the early 1990s, about half its revenues came from huge mainframe computers sold to businesses. These mainframes had hardware and software bundled into one system. The world, however, was fast shifting to smaller and mid-sized machines running on microprocessors. The technology universe was witnessing the unbundling of hardware and software with different vendors specializing in each segment. Companies like HP, Sun, Compaq, and Dell were eating IBM's lunch on hardware, and Microsoft and Oracle were starting to dominate software. To make matters worse, individual consumers had started buying personal computers in which IBM had no expertise or experience. The company also had a huge internal bureaucracy that hobbled decision-making. From being the second most profitable company in the world in 1990, IBM lost $16 billion between 1991 and 1993. Lou Gerstner seemed like a strange choice for the board to make. But it worked wonders. Gerstner resorted to a massive cut in expenses by laying off staff, sold many assets to raise cash, transformed the organizational culture to encourage business units to cooperate and not compete, linked the compensation of senior managers to overall company performance, created a single brand message for all units of IBM, and much more. IBM's stock price jumped 7 times from $13 to $77 during his tenure from April 1, 1993 to December 31, 2002. If you want to learn more about Gerstner's miracles, I urge you to read his book Who Says Elephants Can't Dance? Inside IBM's Historic Turnaround. The second business is JCPenney, where Ron Johnson, credited with transforming Target and creating the iconic Apple stores, was brought in as CEO in late 2011. The stock price jumped 24% at the news. The market was betting that Johnson would be the miracle cure for JCPenney. He changed everything at the company: the logo, the store design, the advertisements, the pricing model, and the popular private labels. JCPenney was known for coupons and clearance sales. Johnson ended them. Big mistake. In 2012, sales dropped 25% from $17 billion to $13 billion as customers abandoned the stores en masse. More worryingly, the company suffered an operating loss of $1.3 billion. The board fired Johnson in mid-2013, just 17 months after installing him as CEO. The stock price had dropped 60% during his short tenure. JCPenney never recovered from this fiasco and filed for bankruptcy in May 2020. If we could not predict the fate of turnaround efforts at what appeared to be slam-dunk cases, IBM and JCPenney, what hope do we have in situations that don't seem so clear-cut? The corporate world is brutally competitive. Even the best companies have to run hard just to stay in the same place. How could the probability of success at a troubled company be anything but minuscule? And if so, why would we indulge in the fantasy? Detesting Debt. As a consultant in the early 1990s, I almost always focused on the profit and loss (P&L) account. Revenue, cost, profit. Almost nothing else mattered. Remarkably, a consultant's P&L obsession remains intact. My niece is currently a consultant in London and primarily serves private equity clients. She is hyper-focused on just one aspect of P&L: EBITDA, earnings before interest, tax, depreciation, and amortization. P&L obsession is not limited to consultants. Read any analyst report or listen to conference call recordings that discuss quarterly results. You will be inundated with comments and questions on revenues, costs, and profit. After many years of investing, I realized that I needed to focus as much, if not more, on the company's balance sheet. Receivables, inventory, payables, fixed assets. And most important of all, debt. Corporate finance theory has a thing for leverage. For those of you who are not familiar with it, finance academics claim that companies need to have an optimal level of leverage to improve returns. If a company can borrow money to purchase assets, its return on equity and earnings per share should improve. Mathematically, this is undoubtedly true. Realistically, this is undoubtedly dangerous. What could be more important than improving short-term return on equity and earnings per share for a business? In my view, two things. Start with the easy one: survival. There is no point in improving return on equity by a few percentage points if it compromises long-term survival. The COVID-19 crisis demonstrated clearly that the companies caught with their pants down were the ones with substantial leverage. In the second quarter of 2020, the following are just some of the well-known companies that announced bankruptcy: Gold's Gym, Hertz, Intelsat, J.Crew, JCPenney, Neiman Marcus, and Sur La Table. Here's what is common across all these names: all had a large amount of debt. It is not impossible for an unleveraged business to go belly up, but it sure is quite hard. If I were to list the 20 biggest bankruptcies in the United States, you would notice that all, with Lehman at the top and LyondellBasell at number 20, were heavily indebted. One might argue that these businesses were unlucky and that everything would have been fine if there had been no COVID-19. One might also contend that mismanagement or other factors contributed more to their downfall than debt. And that correlation is not causation. Maybe, but it's one hell of a correlation. As a long-term investor in a business, I don't want the company ever to go bankrupt, whether the times are good or bad. I can live with a slightly lower return on equity and lower earnings per share (EPS) growth, but at least I will live. Not having high leverage probably makes sense to everyone. But the following may not. I am an advocate of no leverage. More than 90% of our portfolio companies have and have always had excess cash. Only 3 businesses out of about 30 in our portfolio have some debt. But even this debt is quite small. The maximum debt-to-equity ratio among these 3 is 0.3. Why would I demand zero debt when a modest level would not compromise the survival of the business? The answer lies in the following Business Insider headline: no layoff, Asian Paints will give salary increments to boost employees' morale. Asian Paints is India's largest paints business and probably one of the country's best-run businesses. As an aside, it is sadly not in our portfolio. I had a chance to buy it during the global financial crisis of 2008, but I refused to pay 15% more for the privilege of owning this marvelous compounder. I was a fool. Anyway, let's return to a more pleasant topic. This no-layoff salary increment story would not be newsworthy in normal times. But this announcement was made on May 15, 2020. At the time, India had been under an almost complete lockdown since mid-March as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. Every business was witnessing a catastrophic decline in revenues and profits. Also, no one had any visibility as to when the situation would improve. Remember that the possibility of vaccines wasn't even on the horizon in May 2020. Asian Paints was itself going through a catastrophic quarter. During the period from April to June 2020, the company's revenue declined by 43%, and its net profit went down by 67% compared to the same period in 2019. Was the company foolish to be increasing salaries in this period? No, just cash rich. In March 2020, at the start of the pandemic, the company had $220 million cash. Its revenue for the year ended March 2020 was $2.9 billion. Which brings me to the second reason I detest any debt. This answer is often underappreciated and even ignored by investors and management. It is this: debt diminishes strategic flexibility and hence long-term value creation. For a day trader or even an investor whose holding period ranges from 3 to 5 years, a reasonable amount of leverage may not matter. But for a permanent owner like Nalanda, any constraint that prevents a business from taking calculated strategic bets is undesirable. Asian Paints is the leader in the highly competitive Indian paints industry. Its competitors can and do copy what the business is trying to do. However, every few years, the company gets an opportunity to make an investment or take a strategic bet that its competitors find hard to emulate. The salary increase was one such bet. But it did not stop there. The company sanitized its dealers' paint shops without charging any fees, offered medical insurance to its painters, gave 45-day extensions on payments to its dealers, and announced relief worth more than $5 million to its contractors. The CEO, Amit Singhal, pointed out, "We have been debt-free for years and are quite comfortably placed even if the uncertainty goes on for the next 4 or 5 months." The impact of the company's largesse may not be felt in the short term, but the long-term impact is likely to be significant. Asian Paints was able to commit to these highly unusual actions only because, apart from their exceptional strategic vision, they had no debt. The global pandemic is an extreme case, and one may assert that it would be foolhardy to keep excess cash on hand for a once-in-a-century event. But this premise is false. Bad things happen to businesses at remarkably regular intervals. The harsh reality of companies in any capitalist society, and the reason to always have cash, is not that things can go wrong, but that they do go wrong. Businesses suffer adversity across a wide range of situations. The macroeconomic environment can become a stiff headwind, as in the global financial crisis of 2008, or a recession. The industry can suffer a cyclical downturn. A well-funded competitor can start overspending on advertising or giving discounts. The company can lose some of its best employees to competitors. One or more major customers can leave or go belly up. Consumer tastes can suddenly change. A large strategic acquisition or investment may not pay off. A factory can catch fire or a supplier may get in trouble. Currency can move adversely in a foreign market that contributes to significant sales. Regulations can get in the way. The company can get sued for a significant amount. I could go on and on. None of these issues is hypothetical. I have seen all of these happen to our portfolio companies over more than 2 decades of investing. Occasionally, 2 or more problems can arise simultaneously, putting significant pressure on businesses. While worrying about market share loss, low supplier commitment, competitor aggression, and employee dissatisfaction, the last thing management should worry about is interest payments. In my experience, only when the financial risk is low can management focus on mitigating business risks. I have always maintained that the notion of an optimal capital structure that requires companies to have leverage, which is espoused by corporate finance theorists, is not just wrong but dangerous. A strong balance sheet is not the one that maximizes debt to minimize the cost of capital, but the one that minimizes debt to maximize the safety of capital. Fortunately, none of the owners of Nalanda portfolio companies studied finance at fancy business schools. Ignoring M&A Junkies. Nothing happens in well-oiled businesses on a day-to-day basis. Sorry, a lot happens, but it's largely mundane, repetitive, uninteresting, dull, and monotonous. And this is the way it should be. Imagine the day-to-day operations of a business that sells bars of bath soap. Here is a typical day or week or month or year. The factory manufactures bars of soap in the thousands and performs quality control checks to reject defects. The packing department stacks the bars in boxes. Logistics ensures timely shipping at pre-agreed costs. Warehouses stock the boxes in assigned positions. Last-mile delivery delivers the bars on time, and the finance department records the payments received from the retailers. No news. No excitement. What would be the best way for such a business, or any business for that matter, to get reported on in the Wall Street Journal or the Financial Times? M&A. In industry parlance, mergers and acquisitions. For some reason, the media love the news of one business merging with or acquiring another one. The investment bankers and financiers who make fat fees love them even more. Following such an announcement, the CEO is typically invited to a CNBC interview during which they will extol the virtues of strategic fit, synergies, culture fit, and other boilerplate platitudes uttered in every single M&A. They are almost always wrong. Most mergers and acquisitions fail. Here are the statements made by the CEOs of AOL and Time Warner when they announced their $350 billion merger on January 10, 2000. Stephen Case, the co-founder of AOL, proudly proclaimed, "This is a historic moment when new media has truly come of age." Not to be left behind, Gerald Levin, the CEO of Time Warner, gushed philosophically that the internet had begun to create unprecedented and instantaneous access to every form of media and to unleash immense possibilities for economic growth, human understanding, and creative expression. The result of this bromance? The largest failed merger in the history of the corporate world. Within 2 years, AOL took a write-off of $99 billion on the deal. Yes, billion with a B. The market value of AOL went from $226 billion in 2000 to $20 billion in 2002. In June 2015, it was acquired for a mere $4.4 billion by Verizon. Go ahead and blame me for cherry-picking. Guilty as charged. But think about this. AOL and Time Warner were undisputed leaders in their industries. They had highly regarded CEOs, their boards were exemplary, their financial position was rock solid, they employed supremely talented and motivated staff, they had access to the best consultants, and yet they failed. Miserably. If they couldn't hack it, what chance do most companies have? The sad fact is the disastrous AOL Time Warner saga plays out thousands of times every year. And an even sadder fact is that everyone knows about it. There is a lot of literature available on the high failure rate of M&A. A Harvard Business Review article by Clayton Christensen and others titled "The Big Idea, The New M&A Playbook" claims that 70 to 90% of mergers and acquisitions fail. A KPMG study claims that 83% of merger deals did not create value. A Cornell University research article declares that an abundance of empirical research has examined the performance of acquirers across all industries, and in general has failed to find consistent evidence of improvements in value after the acquisition. An organizational dynamics research article by Toby J. Tettenbaum asserts that 60 to 80% of all mergers are financial failures, and a study by Great Prairie Group cites studies from McKinsey, Harvard Business School, Bain, and the Wharton School to state that the M&A failure rate is over 70%. In all these studies, the reasons for failure include culture mismatch, overpayment, misevaluation of the opportunity, external factors, and integration problems, among many others. But they don't point out the single biggest reason we detest M&A: opportunity cost. Let's visit the German giant Bayer to understand this reason. Dr. Maren Deckers, the chair of Bayer AG, had every reason to be proud in 2015. During his 5 years as chair, this life sciences company has grown revenue from €35 billion to €46 billion, and its EPS had more than tripled from €1.60 per share to €5 per share. It continued its reign as the largest company on the German stock exchange with a market value of about €140 billion. The 2015 annual report was replete with good news. Without being boastful, Dr. Decker's excellent commentary made it evident that the company was one of the world's leading life sciences businesses. The only piece of bad news was tucked away on page 7 of the report. Dr. Deckers wrote, "This is my last chairman's letter to you as CEO of Bayer." How bad was Dr. Decker's revelation for Bayer? In 2020, its sales had fallen to €41 billion from €46 billion in 2015, from being a highly profitable business with a return on equity of 18% in 2015. It declared a net loss of €10 billion and its dividend per share was 20% lower than in 2015. Oh, and by June 2021, less than 6 years after the glorious year of 2015, Bayer's market value had declined by 65% to €50 billion. What happened? Within 10 days of Dr. Decker's departure, Bayer made a bid to acquire Monsanto, the U.S. agrochemical giant. Bayer ended up paying $63 billion for the acquisition, which was more than Bayer's market value in June 2021. If you read reports on the reasons for this disaster, most will focus on Bayer losing multiple lawsuits and incurring billions in damages because plaintiffs were able to convince the U.S. courts that Monsanto's Roundup weed killer causes cancer. The reports aren't wrong, but they miss the real value destroyer invisible in the Bayer-Monsanto transaction and the reason we abhor almost all M&A, opportunity cost. Stated simply, most analyses of M&A failure focus on the bad things that happened rather than on the good things that didn't happen. Let's see what Bayer may have missed doing by making a gargantuan acquisition. These actions and inactions fall into 3 categories: divestiture of attractive businesses, reduced focus on existing businesses, and missed opportunities. After acquiring Monsanto, Bayer had to divest many of its core businesses for 2 reasons. First, regulators forced them to do so because both companies were large players in the agrochemical sector. Second, Bayer had to pay down the huge debt they had incurred to finance the deal. Bayer's net debt had gone up 10 times from €3.6 billion in 2017 to €36 billion in 2018. In 2017, Bayer divested large parts of its seed and herbicide businesses for €6 billion. In 2018, it sold its 60% stake in a highly lucrative business called Currenta for €1 billion and sold the consumer brands Copper Tone and Dr. Scholl's. In 2020, Bayer exited its leading and highly profitable animal health business for €7 billion. If we add up the sale value of these divestitures, that's at least €15 billion, or about 30% of Bayer's market value in mid-2021. These businesses had been owned and run by Bayer for decades, and so it is possible that the market was assigning a much higher value than €15 billion to them when they were inside Bayer. The future benefit from these attractive businesses was lost forever. The geese-laying golden eggs were slaughtered to buy a hen that refused to lay any eggs. The second major opportunity cost is a reduced focus on existing businesses because of the distraction of a bad acquisition. You can see this in Bayer's annual reports of 2018, 2019, and 2020, in which a lot of ink was expended on justifying the acquisition and on steps being taken to mitigate the disaster. As usual, numbers tell a better story, as I will explain next. Bayer has 3 business divisions: pharmaceuticals, consumer health, and crop science. From 2016 to 2020, the sales of its pharma division stayed flat at around €16 billion to €17 billion. Although 2020 was the year of COVID, most global pharma companies did not experience a decline in sales. Could this stagnation have been due to the acquisition distraction? From 2010 to 2015, pharma sales had more than doubled from €6.6 billion to €13.7 billion. From 2015 to 2020, rather than assuming a doubling of sales, let's consider a modest 50% increase in a scenario in which management was not being compelled to fight fires. This would have led to pharma sales of €21 billion. The actual number was €17 billion. I think it's fair to assume that Bayer's pharma division lost sales of €4 billion as a result of the Monsanto acquisition. The market value of global pharma companies is about 3 to 5 times sales. Let's be conservative and take a 2.5 times multiple. This is an opportunity cost of at least €10 billion. The operating income of Bayer's consumer health division declined from €1.2 billion in 2015 to €0.8 billion in 2019. Let's ignore 2020, when many consumer businesses were affected by COVID. Most global consumer businesses grew their operating income during this period. Similarly, the operating income of Bayer's crop science division fell from €2.1 billion to €1.9 billion during this period, while its competitors did much better. And remember that Monsanto's acquisition is counted in the crop science division, and so despite the $63 billion acquisition, the operating income of the division fell from 2015 to 2019. In 2015, the operating income of the consumer health and crop science divisions added up to a little more than half the consolidated operating income of Bayer. Thus, we can conservatively assume that at least a third of Bayer's value in 2015 was derived from these two divisions. Since Bayer's value was €140 billion in 2015, we can assign a value of at least €45 billion to €50 billion to these divisions for 2015, which was the total value of Bayer in June 2021. What was the opportunity cost of the underperformance of these two divisions? If the top management had not been consumed by Monsanto's unending troubles and if they had enhanced their 2015 value by 30 to 50% over the next 5 years, we see a likely missed gain of around €15 billion to €25 billion. Let's now come to the third and probably the largest opportunity cost: missed opportunities. For Bayer, this was not making a COVID-19 vaccine. Imagine the end of 2019 at Bayer. The company's leverage has multiplied more than 9 times since 2017 to €34 billion. The U.S. litigation is getting uglier and more costly by the month. The return on capital is down to less than 4% from the high teens a few years earlier, and the investors are as angry as hell with the stock price falling to half its peak also a few years earlier. And then COVID strikes in early 2020. Do you think the senior management assembled around the table at corporate headquarters and said, "Let's bet billions on developing a vaccine that we do not even know is possible"? Would the Bayer management have been willing to take a bet on an uncertain outcome given their dire operating and financial condition? We will never know for sure, and your guess is as good as mine, but a shot in the dark for an uncertain payoff by this long-suffering company? Unlikely. Bayer's 2020 annual report mentions that they signed an agreement with a biotech company to develop and manufacture a COVID-19 vaccine that would be launched in 2022. Meanwhile, for competitors of Bayer, AstraZeneca, Johnson & Johnson, Moderna, and Pfizer had administered about 5 billion doses by July 2021. The COVID-19 vaccine contributes to almost all of Moderna's revenues and profits, and so Moderna is a good candidate to use to assess the notional loss for Bayer. From December 2019, before the pandemic hit, until July 2021, Moderna added about $120 billion, €100 billion to its market value. If we assume that the probability of Bayer's success would have been 50 to 75%, after all, it was one of the global leaders. Bayer has foregone €50 billion to €75 billion in value creation owing to its inability, or was it its unwillingness, to develop a vaccine? If we add up all these numbers, the opportunity cost of Monsanto's acquisition is probably in the range of €90 billion to €100 billion. In other words, instead of about €50 billion in June 2021, Bayer could have been valued at €140 billion to €150 billion. How do we know this is not a massive overstatement? Because Bayer's value in 2015 was €140 billion. If anything, this opportunity cost calculation is a significant understatement because it assumes almost no additional value creation since 2015, while every other major pharmaceutical, consumer, and agrochemical business has added significant value since 2015. I don't know anything about Bayer's management, but presumably they are world-class given their outsized success before 2016. If that's the case, how did they get lulled into making such an acquisition? Because like most acquirers across the world, they genuinely believed that this time it's different. Managers, especially high-performing ones, and their advisors have a sense of invincibility and arrogance when evaluating a target. They firmly believe that they will buck the trend the corporate world has witnessed for a century. Most of them don't realize their folly until it's too late. If a business is a serial acquirer, we stay away. We know we can't price the risk. If we had been evaluating Bayer as a new investment in 2016, we would have passed until we were convinced that management would not repeat its mistakes. Some of our portfolio companies do occasionally make acquisitions. Our counsel to them is to be deeply skeptical of the potential value creation in all cases. I will admit that the success rate of our advice has not been very high. Fortunately, none of our companies is addicted to M&A, and the ones that do make acquisitions have never bet the company. I am convinced that the cost of distraction, even if it was a small one, has not been worth the effort. If any of them start becoming serial acquirers, we will promptly press the exit button. Not predicting where the puck will be. What do mid-19th century railways and late 20th century dot-coms have in common? Railways transformed the United Kingdom in the early 19th century. The first passenger railway between Liverpool and Manchester was authorized by Parliament in 1826 and opened in 1830. Railways allowed people to travel farther at a much lower cost and in less time than the alternatives. They also spurred the growth of cities by enabling cheaper and faster transport of people and building materials. Many entrepreneurs jumped into the fray and by 1844 had opened more than 2,200 miles of railroad line. The stock market loved these companies, which promised growth forever. Between 1843 and 1850, 442 railway companies made a public offering of shares. Between January 1, 1843 and August 9, 1845, the index of railway stock prices doubled. But the bubble burst as they inevitably do. The railway index fell over 67% from 1845 to 1850. Many companies collapsed owing to incompetence, poor financial planning, or fraud. Not unlike the railway mania of the 1840s, with the arrival of the internet in the mid-1990s for the masses, venture capitalists and public markets funded hundreds of companies in the rapidly changing landscape. This was called the dot-com boom. The Nasdaq index of technology stocks jumped fivefold between 1995 and 2000. For the first time in recent capital market history, losing money seemed to be the key to success. In October 1999, just 6 months before the bubble burst, the market value of 199 internet stocks tracked by Mary Meeker, Morgan Stanley's internet analyst, was $450 billion. All these businesses were essentially startups. They had been created in the previous 2 to 5 years. More remarkably, their combined revenue was only $21 billion and their cumulative loss was a staggering $6.2 billion. When discussing the initial public offering IPO of Priceline.com, a venture capitalist at Benchmark admitted, "We're in an environment where the company doesn't have to be successful for us to make money." The year 2000 marked the end of this insanity. By the year 2005, listed Silicon Valley companies had lost 2/3 of their value from market peak. This was equivalent to a staggering $2 trillion loss of shareholder wealth. Venture capital funding collapsed from about $105 billion in 2000 to $21 billion in 2004. Nasdaq had reached its peak in March 2000. It took more than 15 years for it to regain this level. You can now guess the answer to the question I raised at the beginning of this section. The common thread that binds 18th century railways and 20th century dot-coms is the potential for enormous value destruction wrought by a fast-changing industry. There are many similar examples in India of various new and upcoming industries that catch the fancy of investors. When Nalanda was established in 2007, the infrastructure boom was at its peak and some of the leading companies were valued at billions of dollars. The Indian government had finally begun focusing on building roads, airports, power plants, and ports, and private and public equity investors seemed to have an unlimited appetite for these companies. But the infrastructure business in India was in a fledgling state in the late 2000s, the regulations were nascent and untested, and the basis of long-term success was unclear. The ensuing value destruction assumed epic proportions. Two of the affected infrastructure businesses were Reliance Power and Jaiprakash Power Ventures, whose market values were $29 billion and $23 billion, respectively, in early 2008. Each was valued at less than $700 million at the end of 2021, a collapse of more than 97%. The Indian public equity market has witnessed similar booms and busts across other rapidly evolving industries like retail, real estate, education, and microfinance. Private equity has gone wild for non-bank finance companies, NBFCs. New age e-commerce businesses like food and grocery delivery and software as a service and digital education companies, to name just a few. Some companies in industries that change fast ultimately do end up creating a lot of value. But very few companies. The only ones that have created truly significant value from the dot-com era are Amazon and Google. Facebook was founded in 2004. If you want to be charitable, you could add eBay and Priceline, now called Booking Holdings. But that's it. Just step back and think about this for a moment. Only a handful of businesses from the 1995 to 2000 bubble have prospered. To give you a sense of the scale of destruction, 546 IPOs successfully raised $69 billion in 1999 alone. What would have been the probability of finding the next winner? The path to creating wealth in rapidly evolving industries is treacherous, and we refuse to walk on it. Many investors are slaves to the famous quote of the hockey legend Wayne Gretzky, "I skate to where the puck is going to be, not where it has been." I am not one of them. I am just not that smart. In fast-changing industries, I have no idea who will win, when, or how. And to draw the parallel with hockey, since I don't know where the puck is going to be, I refuse to play. We at Nalanda love stable, predictable, boring industries. Give us electric fans over electric vehicles, boilers over biotech, sanitaryware over semiconductors, and enzymes over e-commerce. We like industries in which the winners and losers have been largely sorted out and the rules of the game are apparent to everyone. For everything else, thanks but no thanks. Not aligning with unaligned owners. As an outside and passive owner, we at Nalanda want the company owner to align their interest with the shareholders. We have only one objective as a shareholder of any business: long-term value creation. The company must do this in an ethical, sustainable manner that is fair to all stakeholders, including employees, vendors, suppliers, and customers. But as strange as it may sound, not every owner has the same objective. There are broadly three categories of owners that we avoid to mitigate our Type 1 risk. First, government-owned businesses. Unlike the Western world, India has a large number of publicly traded government-owned companies. They are almost always cheap, and for a value investor, they have been unhappy hunting grounds for as long as I can remember. I say unhappy because most of these cheap businesses almost always stay cheap. Some fund managers may have figured out a way to invest successfully in government-owned businesses, but we will not invest in a government-owned enterprise at any price. The government wants to achieve multiple objectives with their businesses, some of which may have nothing to do with enhancing value and profits. For example, the Indian state and federal governments regularly resort to farm loan waivers. This involves forgiving the loans of farmers who have borrowed from government-owned banks. The loan waiver trend started in 1990. The first waiver was for $1.4 billion and continues today. Almost every state and federal government has gotten on the bandwagon over the past 3 decades. This may suit the governments and maybe even the farmers. I say maybe because farmers may not find it easy to borrow the next time they go to the bank. But it may be destructive for the minority shareholder. It is not unusual for the Indian government to reward a senior bureaucrat by giving them a senior position at a government-owned business. Again, this may suit the bureaucrat but not a shareholder. We have nothing against bureaucrats, but the skill required to run a company successfully in a competitive environment is not the same as that needed to manage a district or devise a sound social policy for a state. Some businesses, especially the public sector oil companies, occasionally become cash-rich and the government then uses them as a piggy bank to manage their fiscal deficit. It suits the government, but how can this be beneficial for a shareholder? It is not that the government objectives are wrong, they make sense in the light of the multiple constituencies whose needs they are trying to meet. Their objectives are just different from ours. The second category of owners we avoid religiously is the listed subsidiaries of global giants. A few decades ago, the Indian government forced all Indian subsidiaries of global multinational companies, MNCs, to list in the domestic market. Global MNCs like Cummins, Nestle, Procter & Gamble, P&G, Siemens, Unilever, and many others have locally listed subsidiaries. Some are fairly large by Indian standards. For example, the Unilever subsidiary in India, Hindustan Unilever, is valued at about $70 billion. At first glance, it may appear that these MNCs should be aligned with the Indian minority shareholder. But there have been many instances when they weren't. A few decades ago, a large global MNC with a listed company in India set up a separate fully owned subsidiary. This makes no logical sense because the global giant has only one listing in its home market. For a minority shareholder of the listed Indian business, this was a stab in the back because the fully owned subsidiary now does a significant amount of business. So why would the parent company do this? Isn't it interested in value creation? Yes, it is. But it is more interested in the value creation of the parent, not the Indian-listed child. By creating a separate fully owned business, the global MNC has ensured that value accrues to the shareholders in its home market at the cost of the Indian minority shareholder. It gets worse. My friends who have worked for many years in this MNC have told me that its best managers are sent to the privately held business, not the listed company. What can a minority shareholder do? Absolutely nothing. Not all MNCs resort to such shenanigans, but enough do. Even if an MNC has behaved well in the past, there is no reason it wouldn't change its mind in the future. There is a structural problem with an arrangement in which a parent also has a listed subsidiary. We have better things to do than to participate in this inherent conflict. Last, we are not fans of the Indian conglomerates. The best known is the Tata Group, which Jamsetji Tata established in 1868. The group had 29 listed businesses with combined revenues of $128 billion and a market value of $311 billion as of March 2022. They manufacture steel, gold jewelry, air conditioners, tea, and cars. Oh, and they also own and operate 5-star luxury hotels from Mumbai to New York. There are many others like Adani, Aditya Birla, L&T, Mahindra, and RP Sanjeev Goenka. All typically run a gamut of unrelated businesses across a wide range of industries. We believe that value creation is possible only through sustained focus. However, while focus is necessary, it does not guarantee success in a competitive world. Most focused businesses aren't successful. So how does one achieve excellence in multiple entities across entirely different industries? It's hard but not impossible. One of the world's leading technology services businesses is a Tata Group company called TCS, whose market value of around $150 billion was about 25% more than that of IBM in mid-2022. You may have seen its name splashed across Manhattan in November in the years it sponsored the New York City Marathon. TCS is the exception that proves the rule. Maybe the Indian conglomerates will succeed in creating great businesses across their entire portfolios one day. But we are unwilling to wait for that glorious future. But you would have missed Tesla. Yup, we would have. We issue a very long list of risks. This is the core element of our investment strategy. We don't invest in businesses run by crooks, we detest turnarounds, we stay as far away from leverage as possible, we refuse to engage with M&A addicts, we can't figure out fast-changing industries, and we don't align ourselves with unaligned owners. Are there any businesses left for us to invest in? In India, not many. At Nalanda, our shortlist comprises 75 to 80 companies out of a universe of about 800 with a market value of more than $100 million. Except for filial love, nothing in life comes free. Nalanda's approach has a trade-off that many of you may find unacceptable. Imagine it's late 2017 and you are impressed with all the media coverage of Tesla. The product seems like a winner based on its vast fan following. The CEO looks as impressive as the car he makes. But in 2017, Tesla had a net debt of about $7 billion and had suffered an operating loss of $1.6 billion. The company was also burning cash very fast. It had consumed $4.1 billion during the year. The traditional car businesses like BMW, Ford, GM, and Toyota had not yet entered the electric vehicle fray, but they had announced big plans. We abhor debt in general, but debt in a loss-making company with negative free cash flow in a fast-changing industry? One can get fired at Nalanda for proposing an investment in a business like this. If you had listened to what we had to say about the business, you would not have invested. Your opportunity loss? 10 times your money over the next 3 years. When we started Nalanda in 2007, there was a lot of buzz around a company called Eicher Motors led by a young, dynamic guy called Siddhartha Lal. Lal had inherited a hodgepodge of poor-quality businesses from his father in 2004. They manufactured motorcycles, footwear, garments, tractors, trucks, auto components, and a few other products, and none was an industry leader. In a remarkably bold strategic move, Lal decided to divest 13 of the 15 businesses to focus on just 2 products, trucks and motorcycles. Almost every analyst was gung-ho about the future of Eicher. They were all taken in by its dynamic leader who was aggressively culling businesses, something that Indian firms rarely did. However, in 2007 this was a turnaround story with no empirical evidence of success. The company's biggest hit, the Enfield Classic motorcycle, was launched only in 2010. We decided not to invest in the business. By the 2010s, the company's motorcycles had taken on cult status in the Indian consumer's mind. Sales exploded from just 52,000 units in 2009 to 822,000 units in 2019, a 16-fold growth. If you had listened to what we had to say about the business, you would not have invested. Your opportunity loss? 70 times your money from 2007 until 2021. Tesla and Isham Motors are the kinds of Type 2 error we will inevitably commit because we reject highly indebted businesses, rapidly evolving industry landscapes, and turnarounds. But we will not change our approach. For every Tesla and Isham, hundreds of unproven business models and turnaround stories are unceremoniously consigned to the dustbin of history. We believe our success is contingent upon our being comfortable with missing out on Teslas and Ishams because on average, avoiding Type 1 errors works wonders over the long term. It has done so for us. A bumblebee is a hairy insect that barely measures an inch in length. The species, there are about 300 of them, have been around for about 30 million years. They are preyed upon by crab spiders and birds. Their survival strategy was beautifully demonstrated in an experiment conducted by Dr. Tom Ings and Professor Lars Chitka of Queen Mary University of London, whose work was published in Science Daily in 2008. The scientists created a garden of artificial flowers that also contained some robotic crab spiders. They hid some spiders and made others visible. Whenever a bumblebee landed on a flower with a crab spider, the spider captured the bumblebee between its foam pincers. Within a few seconds, the robotic spider released the bee. The team found that the bumblebees soon started committing more Type 2 errors. They started avoiding flowers even where there were no spiders, thereby reducing their foraging efficiency. In the wild, this instinct to avoid danger at the cost of going hungry must have played a significant role in the tremendous success of the species over millions of years. If the bumblebee can, why can't we? Chapter Summary. Evolutionary theory has taught me that the first and probably most important step in reimagining investing is to learn how not to invest. 1. Living things prioritize survival over everything else. In the animal world, this applies to prey and predator. Plants give up on opportunities to grow by redirecting resources when survival is at stake. 2. Millions of years of evolution have programmed the organic world to minimize errors of commission in favor of errors of omission. 3. Buffett's 2 rules of investing, never lose money and don't forget to never lose money, are essentially a diktat for eliminating significant risks. 4. At Nalanda, we want to be permanent owners of high-quality businesses. Hence, we want to minimize risk before maximizing returns. 5. Just like the living world, we forego potentially juicy opportunities if the risk of losing our capital is high. 6. We do this by avoiding crooks, turnarounds, high debt, serial acquirers, fast-changing industries, and unaligned owners. I believe we can be better investors only if we are better rejectors. 7. One downside of this approach is that we occasionally walk away from a potentially attractive investment. We are willing to live with this downside.